Julian Miller had always been a man of precision and focus. As a former restorer of historic landmarks, he was used to piecing together fragments of history and transforming ruins into masterpieces. Now retired, he had returned to his roots, inheriting a sprawling piece of land just outside a small town. The property, passed down through generations, was more than just a plot of earth to Julian. It was a sanctuary, a place where he could finally find peace. The land itself was an untamed beauty, wild meadows, a small grove of oak trees, and a modest farmhouse that had weathered decades of storms. Julian had plans for it. He wanted to transform it into a private ecological haven, a tribute to his family's legacy. But on a crisp spring morning, as Julian walked out of his home with a cup of coffee in hand, he stopped dead in his tracks. His front yard, once a peaceful expanse of grass and wildflowers, was now overrun with old, rusting buses. 20 of them, to be exact, arranged in a disorganized cluster that stretched across his land like a chaotic junkyard. The buses weren't just parked, they were occupied. People were moving around them, unloading supplies, setting up makeshift tents, and hanging laundry from the sides. Smoke from a small campfire curled into the air, and the sound of a hammer echoed as someone pounded nails into a wooden plank. It was as if a traveling caravan had decided to turn his land into a permanent campsite. Julian stood there for a moment, disbelief washing over him. He hadn't given anyone permission to be here. Who were these people? What gave them the right to trespass on his property? Setting his coffee down on the porch railing, he marched across the yard toward the group. As he approached, a tall man with a weathered face and a self-assured smirk stepped forward to meet him. "Morning," the man said casually, as if Julian were the intruder. He was dressed in faded jeans and a flannel shirt, his hands tucked into his pockets. "Name's Garrett." "I suppose you're the owner of this place?" Julian's jaw tightened. "Yes, I am. And you have about 5 minutes to explain why 20 buses are sitting on my property without my permission." Garrett chuckled, as if Julian's anger was an amusing overreaction. "Relax, friend. We're not here to cause trouble. This land, as I'm sure you're aware, is designated as a community space. We're just making use of it temporarily." Julian's brow furrowed. "Community space? This is private property. It's been in my family for decades, and I've got the deed to prove it." Garrett tilted his head, unfazed. That might have been true once upon a time, but things change. Check the local records. This land was marked as communal years ago under a zoning agreement. We're well within our rights to be here. Julian felt a cold wave of frustration and disbelief. Zoning agreement? Communal space? None of this made any sense. He'd gone through the property documents himself. When he inherited the land, there had been no mention of anything like that. "You've got the wrong property," Julian said firmly. "And even if you didn't, you can't just show up with a fleet of buses and take over someone's land without notice. You need to leave. Now." Garrett's smirk faded slightly, replaced by a look of calculated calm. "With all due respect, we're not going anywhere. This is a legal matter, and if you have a problem with it, I suggest you take it up with the proper authorities. Until then, we'll be staying put." Julian clenched his fists, his patience wearing thin. But before he could respond, a commotion behind Garrett drew his attention. A group of men was unloading what looked like large barrels from one of the buses. Another was digging a trench near the tree line with a portable backhoe. The sheer scale of their operation hit Julian like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a group of travelers passing through. These people were settling in, and they had no intention of leaving. "Whatever it is you think you're doing here, you're not doing it on my land," Julian said, his voice steely. "I'll be calling the police." Garrett's smirk returned. "Go ahead. But I'd suggest checking your paperwork first. Wouldn't want to waste their time or yours." Julian turned on his heel and marched back toward the house, his mind racing. He pulled out his phone and dialed the local police department. The officer who answered sounded polite but uninterested when Julian explained the situation. "We can send someone out to take a look," the officer said. "But if they're claiming it's a civil matter, it might be out of our jurisdiction. You may need to contact a lawyer." By the time the police arrived an hour later, Garrett was ready. He produced a document that he claimed was proof of his right to use the land. The officer glanced at it, then at Julian. "This looks like a civil dispute," the officer said. "You'll need to take this up with the court system." Julian's frustration boiled over. "So what, you're just going to let them stay here? They're trespassing?" The officer gave him a sympathetic look. "I'm sorry, sir, but unless we can prove this document is fraudulent or that they're breaking criminal law, there's not much we can do." As the police car drove away, Garrett shot Julian a triumphant grin. "Told you. You should have checked your paperwork." Julian stood there, the weight of the situation sinking in. His land, his sanctuary, had been invaded, and the people responsible weren't just squatters, they were organized, confident, and well-prepared. He knew he couldn't let this stand, but he also knew this wasn't a fight he could win by yelling or calling the police. If he wanted his land back, he'd have to think strategically. This was just the beginning. Julian sat in his study, the deed to his property spread out on the desk in front of him. The antique lamp cast a warm glow over the yellowed paper, the elegant signatures and seals confirming what he already knew: this land was his. There was no mention of it being communal, no zoning agreements, no loopholes. He had read every line, every clause, and he was certain that Garrett's claims were false. But certainty wasn't enough. Not when the buses were still parked on his land and the so-called community project was expanding with every passing hour. He stared out the window at the chaos beyond. The group was growing bolder. What had started as a cluster of buses had evolved into a full-blown encampment. Makeshift structures were springing up: wooden platforms, tarps stretched across poles, even a large metal container that had somehow been brought in during the night. The digging had intensified, and now heavy machinery was being used to carve out trenches that scarred the landscape. Smoke from multiple fires curled into the sky, and the sound of hammers and drills filled the air. It was as if they were constructing a fortress right under his nose. Julian felt a mix of anger and helplessness. He had tried reasoning with Garrett, but the man was as slippery as an eel, always deflecting, always smirking. The police had been no help, and hiring a lawyer would take time he might not have if these people continued their rapid expansion. He needed to act now, but every option he considered seemed to lead to a dead end. Calling the police again would only result in the same dismissive response. Confronting Garrett directly would likely escalate the situation. And he couldn't risk taking matters into his own hands, not yet. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. He frowned. No one had visited him since this ordeal began, and he doubted any of the neighbors would want to get involved. Reluctantly, he got up and opened the door to find a young woman standing on his porch. She looked nervous, her eyes darting toward the encampment in the distance. "Hi," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Claire. I live down the road. Can I come in?" "It's about the buses." Julian hesitated for a moment before stepping aside and gesturing for her to enter. Once inside, she glanced around nervously, as if afraid they were being watched. "I know what Garrett's doing," she said, her voice trembling. "And I know it's not legal." Julian's heart skipped a beat. "You do? How?" Claire bit her lip, then reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. Inside were photos, grainy but clear enough to show Garrett and his crew unloading barrels from a truck late at night. Other photos showed workers installing what looked like industrial equipment near one of the trenches. "I've been watching them for weeks," she admitted. "At first I thought they were just squatters, but then I started noticing things. The trucks they bring in, they're unmarked, but the equipment is high-end. And those barrels, they're not for water or food. I looked up the company name on one of the labels. It's a chemical supplier." Julian felt a chill run down his spine. "Chemicals? For what?" Claire shook her head. "I don't know. But whatever they're doing, it's not just some community project." I overheard Garrett talking to one of his guys. "He mentioned a deal, something about flipping the site. I think they're using your land as a staging ground for something bigger." Julian's mind raced. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was far worse than he had imagined. This wasn't just about illegal parking or trespassing. Garrett and his crew were running a full-scale operation, and Julian's property was at the center of it. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, his tone cautious. "If you've been watching them for weeks, why not go to the police?" Claire looked away, her expression troubled. "I tried. But Garrett, he has connections. I don't know how deep it goes, but every time I've tried to report something, it gets shut down." And now her voice broke. "Now they're threatening people. My brother works for one of the companies Garrett's tied to. He told me to keep quiet or there'd be consequences." Julian clenched his fists, his anger boiling over. Garrett wasn't just a con artist, he was a predator, using fear and intimidation to get what he wanted. But fear wasn't going to stop Julian. Not now. "Thank you for telling me," he said firmly. "But I'm not going to let him win. I'll find a way to stop him." Claire nodded, but her eyes were filled with doubt. "Just be careful. He's dangerous." After she left, Julian felt a renewed sense of purpose. He couldn't wait for the legal system to catch up. He needed to expose Garrett for what he really was, and to do that, he needed evidence. Real evidence, the kind that even Garrett's so-called connections couldn't deny. He spent the next few days documenting everything. He took photos and videos of the encampment, capturing the machinery, the barrels, the construction. He kept a detailed log of every truck that came and went, noting license plates and times. He even climbed onto his roof to get a better vantage point, using binoculars to survey the activity. But Garrett wasn't idle. He must have sensed that Julian was becoming a threat, because the harassment began almost immediately. One night, Julian woke to the sound of banging on his windows. When he rushed outside, he found his trash cans overturned and his garden trampled. Another morning, he discovered nails scattered across his driveway, puncturing his tires. And then there were the letters unsigned, typed notes slipped under his door, warning him to back off. Julian refused to be intimidated. Each act of vandalism only strengthened his resolve. He knew Garrett was trying to break him, to push him into giving up, but Julian wasn't going anywhere. This was his land, and he would fight for it. The breakthrough came when Julian decided to investigate the trenches. Late one night, when the encampment was quiet, he crept toward the tree line with a flashlight. The trenches were deeper than he'd expected, lined with what looked like reinforced plastic. At the bottom, partially hidden beneath a layer of dirt, were pipes thick, industrial pipes that didn't belong there. He snapped a few photos, then retreated to his house before anyone could spot him. The discovery only raised more questions. What were the pipes for? And why were they being installed on his land without his knowledge? The next morning, Julian made a decision. It was time to call in reinforcements. He reached out to a private investigator he had worked with years ago during a restoration project. If anyone could uncover the truth about Garrett and his operation, it was her. As he waited for her to arrive, Julian couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Garrett was growing bolder, his crew more aggressive. The encampment was no longer just an eyesore, it was a threat, a cancer spreading across the land. But Julian wasn't afraid. He had faced challenges before, and he had always come out stronger. This would be no different. He stared out the window, watching as the buses loomed like specters in the distance. Garrett thought he had won, thought his connections and lies would protect him. But he had underestimated Julian, and that was a mistake Garrett would come to regret. Julian's phone buzzed on the table, jolting him awake. He blinked groggily, the red numbers on his bedside clock telling him it was just after 6 a.m. Groaning, he reached for the phone, expecting a spam call or another half-hearted update from the authorities. But the name on the screen made him sit up straight. Madison Hayes, the private investigator he had contacted. Morning, Julian Madison's voice was brisk and professional, with a faint undertone of urgency. "I've got preliminary findings on Garrett and his operation. We need to meet. Can I come by in an hour?" Julian agreed without hesitation, the fog of sleep evaporating as adrenaline took over. This was the first real glimmer of progress, and he wasn't going to waste it. By the time Madison arrived, Julian had made coffee and set up a workspace in the study. She strode in carrying a leather satchel, her sharp eyes scanning the room before she dropped into the chair opposite him. Without wasting time on pleasantries, she pulled out a thick folder and began laying out photographs, documents, and a map of Julian's property. Garrett's a professional grifter, she began. He's been running similar schemes for at least 6 years, targeting rural properties with weak zoning enforcement. His MO is consistent: find land with minimal oversight, establish a fake community project or environmental initiative, and use it as a front for illegal activity. The barrels you mentioned? They're part of it. I suspect he's storing or disposing of hazardous materials under the guise of a communal effort. Julian leaned forward, his jaw tightening as he absorbed her words. And the buses, what are they about? Madison tapped a photo of the encampment. They're mobile housing for his workers, who are likely being paid under the table to help with construction and transport. Garrett doesn't just squat, he builds. I've found evidence that he's installed underground infrastructure on at least 2 other properties he's taken over. My guess is that he's preparing to lease the land to a third party, likely a company that doesn't want their name tied to a questionable operation. Julian's mind raced as he tried to piece together the implications. So this isn't just about my property, it's about money. He's using my land to hide something valuable or dangerous. Exactly, Madison confirmed. And he's betting you don't have the resources to fight him. If he follows his usual pattern, he'll either pressure you into selling for a fraction of what the land is worth or stay long enough to devalue the property until no one else will touch it. Julian exhaled sharply, anger bubbling beneath the surface. I won't let that happen. How do we stop him? Madison hesitated, her sharp demeanor softening for a moment. It won't be easy. Garrett's good at covering his tracks. His documents might be forged, but proving that in court will take time. Meanwhile, he's working fast to entrench himself. You need to disrupt his operation without crossing any legal lines. Julian nodded grimly. I'll do whatever it takes. Just tell me where to start. Madison outlined a plan. The first step was to gather undeniable evidence of illegal activity, something so blatant that even Garrett's connections couldn't sweep it under the rug. She recommended installing discrete cameras around the property to monitor movement, focusing on the trenches and barrels. She also suggested contacting environmental agencies to report potential violations. Later that afternoon, Julian began implementing the plan. He spent hours carefully positioning cameras in trees and along fences, ensuring they would capture key areas without being easily spotted. The process was meticulous and nerve-wracking, especially with Garrett's crew working just a few hundred yards away. More than once, Julian caught glimpses of the men unloading supplies, hammering stakes into the ground, and hauling equipment to the trenches. Every sight filled him with a mix of fury and determination. That evening, Madison called with another update. I've been digging into the ownership of those buses. Turns out they're registered to a shell company that's tied to Garrett. The company's address leads to a P.O. box in a neighboring state. But I've flagged it for further investigation. If we can prove the buses are part of an unlicensed operation, it'll give us leverage. Julian thanked her, feeling a flicker of hope for the first time in days. But the next morning, that hope was tested. He woke to the sound of engines rumbling outside. Peering through the window, he saw a convoy of trucks arriving at the encampment. The vehicles were unmarked, their drivers unloading crates and more barrels with practiced efficiency. It was clear that Garrett's operation was ramping up. Julian quickly grabbed his camera and began documenting the activity, his pulse pounding as he zoomed in on the license plates and the logos on the crates. Just as he was about to step back inside, a shout rang out. "Hey!" Julian froze, his heart leaping into his throat. One of Garrett's men had spotted him and was striding toward the fence, his expression a mix of annoyance and aggression. "What do you think you're doing?" the man demanded, stopping a few feet away. Julian steadied himself, meeting the man's glare. "I'm on my property documenting what's happening. You have no right to be here." The man smirked, his posture shifting into something more threatening. "You're playing a dangerous game, old man. Garrett doesn't like nosy neighbors." "Then Garrett shouldn't trespass," Julian shot back, his voice firm despite the unease twisting in his gut. The man laughed darkly and turned away, muttering something under his breath as he walked back to the encampment. Julian watched him go, his fists clenched. The exchange left him rattled, but it also reinforced his resolve. Garrett's crew was trying to intimidate him, but he wouldn't back down. That night, Madison called with a chilling update. "I found something you need to see. Garrett's shell company was involved in a lawsuit 3 years ago. The plaintiff accused them of illegally dumping toxic waste on their property. The case was settled out of court. But the timing matches Garrett's activities. He's using your land as a dumping ground, Julian, and if those barrels contain what I think they do, it's only a matter of time before the contamination spreads." Julian felt a cold weight settle in his chest. His land wasn't just being stolen, it was being poisoned. The stakes were higher than he'd realized, and the urgency to act became overwhelming. The next morning, he called the State Environmental Agency and filed a formal complaint. He described the barrels, the trenches, and the unmarked trucks, providing photos and videos as evidence. The agent on the other end of the line promised to escalate the matter, but Julian couldn't shake the feeling that it might already be too late. As he hung up, his phone buzzed with a text from Madison. It was a single sentence, accompanied by a photo of a document she had uncovered. "Garrett's crew plans to expand their operation this week. Expect more trucks." Julian stared at the message, his anger hardening into determination. Garrett was about to find out that he'd picked the wrong man to cross. The fight was far from over, and Julian was just getting started. The sun had barely risen when Julian received a knock at his door. He opened it to find Madison Hayes standing there, looking unusually tense. She carried a thick envelope under her arm and glanced over her shoulder toward the encampment before stepping inside. "Julian," she said, her voice low and urgent, "we've got a serious problem." She placed the envelope on the dining table and pulled out a stack of documents, along with several grainy photographs. Julian scanned the photos, his stomach sinking. They showed large industrial pipes being buried in the trenches on his land. Another image revealed barrels being loaded into what appeared to be an underground storage area. "This is worse than I thought," Madison continued. "Garrett isn't just using your land as a dumping ground. He's building an illegal storage network. These pipes connect to a nearby facility, a facility that doesn't exist on any public records. I dug into the company behind the trucks delivering the equipment, and they're tied to an offshore entity specializing in hazardous material disposal. Garrett is working for them, and they're paying him to hide toxic waste on your property." Julian's fists clenched. "They're burying poison on my land." Madison nodded grimly. "And if we don't stop them soon, it'll be too late. Once the waste is in the ground and sealed off, removing it will be nearly impossible without massive legal and environmental intervention." Julian felt a surge of anger and frustration. His land, the place that had been his family's sanctuary for generations, was being defiled right under his nose. He wanted to storm down to the encampment, confront Garrett, and force him and his crew off the property. But he knew that wouldn't work. Garrett was too clever, too prepared. Every move he made was calculated, and Julian couldn't afford to play into his hands. "What do we do?" Julian asked, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside him. "We need more evidence," Madison replied. "Enough to force the authorities to act. Right now we have photos and documents, but we need hard proof, something undeniable that ties Garrett directly to this operation and its criminal intent." Julian nodded. "Then let's get it." That evening, as darkness fell over the property, Julian and Madison set their plan into motion. Madison had brought a small, high-powered drone equipped with a camera. From the cover of the tree line, they launched the drone and guided it toward the encampment. The drone's camera feed displayed on Madison's tablet, showing a bird's-eye view of the site. The encampment was bustling with activity even at night. Workers moved between the buses, carrying tools and equipment. Near the trenches, a group of men was operating a crane, lowering something large and metallic into the ground. Julian's jaw tightened as he watched the scene unfold. "Zoom in," he said, pointing to the tablet. Madison adjusted the drone's camera, focusing on the object being lowered into the trench. It was a massive steel container, its sides marked with warning labels that were visible even in the dim light. The labels read "hazardous material" and "flammable." "That's it," Madison said, her voice tense. "That's the smoking gun we needed." She guided the drone lower, capturing close-up footage of the container and the workers handling it. The video feed showed Garrett standing nearby, barking orders and gesturing toward the trench. "Got him," Madison muttered, zooming in on Garrett's face. But just as she was about to move the drone to another angle, a worker looked up, his eyes narrowing as he spotted the device. He shouted something, and Garrett turned sharply, his gaze locking onto the drone. "They've seen us," Madison said, her fingers flying over the controls. She quickly guided the drone back toward the tree line, but not before one of Garrett's men raised a rifle and fired. The screen went black as the drone was hit, crashing somewhere in the brush. "Damn it," Madison hissed, shoving the tablet into her bag. "We need to get out of here before they start looking for us." Julian followed her as they retreated to the house, his heart pounding. The footage they had captured was invaluable, but Garrett's reaction made it clear that things were about to escalate. The next morning, Julian woke to find a bright red notice taped to his front door. It was from a local contractor, informing him that his property was scheduled for emergency excavation under a municipal order. The document claimed that the land was being cleared for safety reasons, citing a fabricated environmental hazard. Julian crumpled the notice in his hand, his blood boiling. Garrett was pulling strings again, using his connections to push Julian off the land. But Julian wasn't about to back down. He contacted Madison and forwarded the footage from the drone to the state environmental agency. This time, the response was immediate. The agency dispatched an inspector to the site, but when the inspector arrived, Garrett's crew had already covered the trenches and removed most of the barrels. "They're cleaning up the evidence," Madison said when Julian relayed the news. "They know we're onto them." Julian slammed his fist on the table. "We need to act faster. If they finish what they're doing, they'll disappear, and I'll be left with a poisoned property and no way to prove it." That evening, Madison made a bold suggestion. "We need to find the underground storage. If we can access it and document what's inside, it'll be impossible for them to deny what they've done. But it's risky. Garrett's men are watching the site closely." Julian didn't hesitate. "Let's do it." Under the cover of darkness, they approached the encampment from a different angle, avoiding the main paths and sticking to the shadows. Madison had pinpointed the likely location of the underground storage based on the drone footage and the layout of the trenches. They found the entrance hidden beneath a camouflage tarp. It was a steel hatch, secured with a heavy lock. Madison pulled out a set of tools and began working on the lock, her movements swift and precise. "Hurry," Julian whispered, glancing over his shoulder. The lock clicked open, and they lifted the hatch to reveal a narrow ladder descending into darkness. Madison went first, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. Julian followed, his heart pounding as they climbed down into the underground chamber. What they found took his breath away. The chamber was massive, its walls lined with rows of barrels and containers. The air was thick with the acrid smell of chemicals, and warning labels covered nearly every surface. "This is it," Madison said, pulling out her camera. She began documenting everything, capturing close-ups of the containers, the warning labels, and the industrial pipes that snaked along the walls. But their luck didn't hold. As they prepared to leave, the sound of voices echoed from above. Garrett's men had found the open hatch. "Go," Madison hissed, shoving Julian toward the ladder. They climbed out just as the men reached the area. Julian and Madison sprinted into the woods, adrenaline fueling their escape. Behind them, shouts and flashlights pierced the darkness, but they didn't stop until they were safely back at the house. Madison turned to Julian, her face flushed but determined. "We've got everything we need. Now it's time to bring Garrett down." Julian nodded, his resolve stronger than ever. This was his land, his family's legacy, and he wasn't going to let Garrett destroy it. The battle wasn't over, but Julian finally had the upper hand. The morning after their daring escape from the underground storage, Julian and Madison were both exhausted but determined. Madison had spent the night compiling the evidence they'd gathered: photos, videos, and a detailed report on Garrett's operation. They had everything they needed to take the fight to the authorities, but Julian knew that Garrett wouldn't sit idly by. The man was too clever and too ruthless to let them move unchecked. Sure enough, by midday, the retaliation began. Julian had just stepped outside to inspect the far side of his property when he heard the sound of heavy machinery. He turned toward the encampment and froze. A convoy of bulldozers and excavators was rolling onto his land, followed by several flatbed trucks carrying building materials. Workers jumped out of the trucks and began unloading supplies, while the machinery roared to life, tearing into the soil near the trenches Garrett's men had previously dug. Julian stormed toward the convoy, fury building with every step. He spotted Garrett standing near one of the buses, clipboard in hand, directing the chaos with the confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Julian shouted over the noise as he approached. Garrett turned, flashing his signature smirk. "Morning, Julian. Just taking care of some business. We've got a tight schedule to keep, you know." "This is my property," Julian yelled, his voice shaking with anger. "You have no right to bring in heavy equipment or start construction here." Garrett raised an eyebrow, his smirk widening. "I think you'll find that's not entirely true." He reached into his clipboard and pulled out a document, handing it to Julian. "Emergency development permit. Signed and approved by the county just yesterday." Julian scanned the document, his stomach sinking. It was stamped and signed by an official, someone in the local government who had clearly been bought off or misled. The permit claimed that the land was being used for community development and environmental restoration, a blatant lie to justify the activity. "You think this piece of paper makes what you're doing legal?" Julian spat, crumpling the document in his hand. "You're poisoning this land, Garrett, and I've got the evidence to prove it." Garrett's smirk faltered for just a moment before returning with a cold edge. "Evidence is only as good as the people willing to listen to it. You've got your little photos and videos, but let me tell you something. Julian, you're up against more than just me. This operation has backing, real money, and real power. If you keep pushing, you're going to find out just how deep that power runs." Julian stood his ground, glaring at Garrett. "I'm not afraid of you. And I'm not afraid of whoever's backing you. This is my land, and I'll fight you every step of the way." Garrett chuckled, shaking his head. "Suit yourself. But don't say I didn't warn you." As Julian walked back to his house, his mind raced. The permit was a major setback, giving Garrett and his crew a veneer of legality that would make it harder to stop them. But Madison's words from the previous night echoed in his mind. "We've got everything we need. Now it's time to bring Garrett down." When he returned to the house, Madison was already on the phone, her voice sharp and commanding. She hung up as Julian entered and turned to him with a grim expression. "I just got off the line with the State Environmental Agency. They're sending a team to inspect the property tomorrow. If they find what we documented, it'll be enough to shut Garrett down." "That's good," Julian said, though his tone was cautious. "But Garrett just escalated. He's brought in construction crews and equipment, and he's got some bogus permit to back it up. He knows we're onto him, and he's speeding up his timeline." Madison frowned. "Then we need to slow him down. If he finishes whatever he's building before the inspectors get here, it'll be harder to prove anything. We need to find a way to stall him." Julian thought for a moment, then nodded. "I'll handle it." That evening, Julian took a calculated risk. Under the cover of darkness, he moved along the edge of his property, avoiding the main paths and staying out of sight. He carried a pair of bolt cutters and a flashlight, his heart pounding with every step. Garrett's crew had set up a temporary fence around the construction site, using padlocks to secure the gates. Julian worked quickly, cutting the locks and loosening the bolts that held the fence panels in place. By the time he was finished, the fence was barely standing, and any strong gust of wind would send it tumbling. The next morning, chaos erupted at the construction site. The workers arrived to find the fence in disarray, their equipment scattered and several trucks unable to access the area. Garrett was livid, barking orders and pacing furiously as his men scrambled to restore order. Julian watched from a distance, a grim satisfaction settling over him. The sabotage had bought them some time, but he knew it wouldn't be long before Garrett retaliated. His prediction came true later that day. Julian was inside, reviewing the evidence with Madison, when he heard the sound of shattering glass. He rushed to the living room to find one of his windows smashed, a rock lying on the floor surrounded by shards of glass. Attached to the rock was a note scrawled in crude handwriting, "Leave it alone, old man, or next time it's more than a window." Julian's hands shook with anger as he showed the note to Madison. "They're trying to scare me off. It's not going to work." "It's a sign we're getting to them," Madison said, though her expression was serious. "But you need to be careful. Garrett's men aren't above using intimidation or worse." The tension reached a boiling point that evening. As the sun set, Julian noticed headlights approaching from the direction of the encampment. A truck pulled into his driveway, and 3 men stepped out, their expressions cold and hostile. Julian stepped outside, standing tall as they approached. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice steady. One of the men, a burly figure with a shaved head, sneered. "You've been messing with our operation. That's going to stop. Now." Julian folded his arms, refusing to back down. "You're trespassing on my property. Leave, or I'll call the police." The man took a step closer, his posture threatening. "Go ahead. But let me tell you something, Garrett's not the only one who knows how to make problems disappear." Before Julian could respond, Madison appeared at the door, her phone in hand. "I'm recording this," she said firmly, holding up the device. "So unless you want your threats on record, I suggest you leave." The men hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances. Finally, the leader spat on the ground and muttered, "You're going to regret this." Then they got back in the truck and drove off. Julian exhaled, his body tense with adrenaline. Madison lowered her phone, her expression resolute. "They're desperate. That means we're close to shutting them down." The next morning, the environmental inspectors arrived, their vehicles cutting through the early mist as they drove onto the property. Julian and Madison greeted them, handing over the evidence they had gathered. The inspectors wasted no time, heading straight for the encampment with cameras and sampling equipment. Garrett tried to intervene, shouting at the inspectors and waving his permit, but they ignored him, their focus unshaken. Within hours, they had documented everything: the buried barrels, the pipes, the hazardous waste. One inspector turned to Julian and nodded. "You were right. This is a major violation. We'll be filing a full report and issuing a cease and desist order immediately." As the inspectors packed up, Julian caught sight of Garrett standing near the buses, his face pale and his smirk finally gone. For the first time, the man looked uncertain, his confidence cracked. Julian allowed himself a small, hard smile. The tide was finally turning. The environmental inspector's visit had shaken Garrett's operation to its core. His workers moved erratically, no longer operating with their usual cocky precision. Trucks were hastily loaded with barrels and equipment, the sound of engines roaring day and night. It was clear that Garrett was preparing to abandon the site, but Julian wasn't fooled. He knew this wasn't over. Garrett wasn't the type to cut his losses without one final attempt to regain control. The confirmation of this came late that night. Julian was sitting at his desk, reviewing the report the inspectors had shared with him, when the power in his house suddenly went out. The hum of the refrigerator and the gentle glow of the desk lamp disappeared in an instant, plunging the house into darkness. Julian's heart sank. He grabbed a flashlight and his phone, checking the breaker box, but everything was intact. This wasn't an accident. Moments later, he heard the unmistakable sound of tires crunching over gravel. Stepping to the window, he saw the headlights of multiple vehicles approaching. His pulse quickened as a caravan of trucks and SUVs rolled onto his property, their engines cutting off one by one. Garrett's silhouette was unmistakable as he stepped out of the lead vehicle, flanked by a dozen of his men. Julian didn't panic. Instead, he grabbed his phone, dialing Madison's number as he headed to the back of the house. "They're here," he whispered. "I'll call the police," she said immediately, her voice tense. "Don't engage with them. Stay safe." Julian hung up and took a deep breath, steeling himself. He wasn't about to let Garrett intimidate him into submission. As he moved to the edge of the property, he kept his flashlight off, relying on the moonlight to navigate. From the shadows, he watched as Garrett and his men approached the house. Julian Garrett's voice cut through the still night air. "We need to have a little talk." Julian remained silent, his hand tightening around the phone. Garrett took a step closer to the porch, scanning the dark windows. "You think you've won, don't you?" Garrett called out, his voice dripping with malice. "You think those inspectors are going to stop me? Let me tell you something: you don't know who you're dealing with. You're playing with fire, old man." Julian's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Garrett gestured to his men, who began spreading out across the property, flashlights cutting through the darkness as they moved toward the trenches and the buses. Julian felt his anger rising. They were going to try to erase the last of the evidence before the authorities could act. He needed to stop them, but how? He wasn't armed, and he wasn't about to confront a dozen men on his own. Instead, he moved silently through the trees toward the trenches, staying low and out of sight. His goal was clear: capture them in the act. When he reached the trenches, he saw a group of workers dismantling the pipes and filling the holes with dirt. Garrett was barking orders, his voice sharp and commanding. Julian crouched behind a fallen log, pulling out his phone to record the scene. The video was shaky, but it clearly showed the barrels, the machinery, and Garrett overseeing the operation. As Julian recorded, he heard the faint wail of sirens in the distance. Madison had done it; the police were on their way. But the sirens only made Garrett more frantic. He turned to his men, shouting, "Move faster. We need to be out of here before they get close." The workers doubled their pace, sweat gleaming on their faces as they shoveled dirt over the remaining barrels. Julian knew the police wouldn't arrive in time to stop them, and his frustration boiled over. He couldn't let Garrett escape unscathed. Summoning his courage, Julian stepped out of the shadows. "You're done, Garrett," he said, his voice loud and steady. The workers froze, their flashlights swinging toward him. Garrett turned slowly, his expression shifting from shock to fury. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" Garrett sneered, stepping toward him. "This isn't your fight anymore, Julian. Walk away before you regret it." Julian held up his phone, the screen still displaying the recording. "This is all I need to finish you. The inspectors already know what's here. The police are on their way. It's over." For a moment, Garrett's bravado faltered. He glanced at his men, clearly weighing his options. But then his expression hardened, and he nodded toward one of the workers. "Get him." Two of the men advanced toward Julian, but before they could reach him, the distant sirens grew louder, piercing the tension. Red and blue lights flashed through the trees, and the sound of car doors slamming echoed across the property. "Police, put your hands where we can see them." Garrett's men scattered, dropping their tools and sprinting toward the trucks. Garrett hesitated, glaring at Julian with pure hatred before turning and running toward his FE. Julian didn't chase him. He stood his ground as officers flooded the scene, their flashlights cutting through the chaos. The workers were quickly rounded up, and Garrett's SUV was intercepted before it could leave the property. The officers pulled him out, slamming him against the hood as they cuffed him. Julian felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was tempered by the sight of the trenches, still partially filled with dirt and barrels. The damage to his land was extensive, and he knew it would take years to fully repair. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of victory. As the police secured the scene and began questioning the workers, Madison arrived, jogging toward Julian with a wide-eyed expression. "Are you okay?" she asked, glancing between him and the officers. "I'm fine," Julian said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Garrett's finished. They've got everything they need to take him down." Madison nodded, her expression softening. "You did it, Julian. You stood your ground." Julian looked out at his land, the moonlight casting long shadows over the trenches and the scattered equipment. It wasn't the ending he'd wanted. His property was scarred, his peace shattered, but it was the victory he needed. Garrett was in custody, his operation exposed, and Julian had protected his family's legacy. "This isn't over," Julian said quietly, more to himself than to Madison, "but at least now we have a chance to rebuild." Madison placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You'll get through this. And Garrett? He's going to pay for everything he's done." Julian nodded, his resolve firm. The battle was over, but the fight to reclaim his land and his life was just beginning. The aftermath of Garrett's arrest left Julian's property in a state of disarray. The trenches remained half-filled, the earth scarred and uneven. Piles of dirt and discarded tools were scattered across the land, while the toxic barrels sat under heavy police watch, waiting to be safely removed by environmental specialists. The once pristine meadow that Julian had cherished was now a battlefield, but for the first time in weeks, the air felt lighter. Garrett was gone, his operation dismantled, and the land was quiet again. In the days following the raid, investigators combed through the property, documenting every piece of evidence left behind. Julian spent hours with them, walking through the site and pointing out key locations. Madison stayed by his side, her sharp mind and methodical nature proving invaluable as they worked to piece together the full extent of Garrett's crimes. One morning, a detective approached Julian with an update. "Garrett's in custody, and we've tied him to several other operations like this one. He's facing multiple charges: fraud, environmental violations, illegal dumping. The evidence you provided was critical in securing his arrest." Julian nodded, feeling a mix of satisfaction and exhaustion. "And the cleanup? How long will it take?" The detective hesitated. "It's going to be a process. The barrels need to be carefully removed and tested to determine the level of contamination. Depending on the results, there may be further remediation required. It could take months, maybe even longer." Julian sighed, the weight of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. But he knew that this was part of the fight he'd chosen to take on. His land was damaged, but it wasn't beyond saving. As the cleanup efforts began, Julian threw himself into restoring what he could. He spent his mornings walking the property, clearing debris, and salvaging what remained of his gardens. Madison continued to assist, her presence a steady source of encouragement. "You're not doing this alone," she said one afternoon, handing him a water bottle as they worked side by side to clear a section of overgrown weeds. Julian managed a small smile. "I appreciate that, but it's hard not to feel like I've lost something important." Madison looked out at the land, her expression thoughtful. "You've lost some ground, sure, but you've also gained something: justice. You stood up to someone who thought they could take everything from you, and you won. That matters." Her words stuck with Julian, and as the days turned into weeks, he began to see the truth in them. The scars on his land were a reminder of the battle he'd fought, but they were also proof of his resilience. Slowly, the property began to transform. The trenches were filled, the toxic barrels removed, and the grass started to grow back. One evening, Julian stood on his porch, watching the sunset cast a golden glow over the landscape. The air was quiet, save for the distant hum of crickets. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to relax. His phone buzzed with a text from Madison. "They're charging Garrett with additional crimes. Looks like he'll be behind bars for a long time." Julian replied with a simple good. He set the phone down and took a deep breath, letting the calm of the evening wash over him. A few weeks later, a group of neighbors arrived, offering their help in rebuilding. Some brought tools, others plants and seeds to restore the gardens. Julian was surprised by their willingness to pitch in, especially since many of them had stayed silent during the ordeal. One neighbor, an older man named Frank, approached Julian as the group worked. "We should have stepped up sooner," Frank admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "Garrett had us all scared, but seeing you stand up to him, it reminded us that we can't let people like that win." Julian nodded, accepting the man's words. "Better late than never," he said, offering a small smile. By the time the group left that evening, the property looked noticeably better. The sight of fresh flowers and newly planted trees filled Julian with a sense of hope. His land was far from what it once was, but it was healing, and so was he. As the weeks turned into months, Julian began to think about the future. He contacted environmental specialists to explore ways to protect the property from future threats, including the possibility of turning it into a conservation site. He also started writing again, documenting his experience as a way to process everything that had happened. One quiet evening, Madison visited, bringing a bottle of wine to celebrate the progress they'd made. They sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one. "You know," Madison said, pouring them each a glass, "you could have walked away from all this. sold the land, moved somewhere easier. But you didn't. Julian sipped his wine, his gaze fixed on the horizon. This land isn't just dirt and trees to me. It's my family's legacy. I wasn't going to let someone like Garrett take that away. Madison raised her glass. To resilience, then. Julian clinked his glass against hers, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. To resilience. As the night deepened, Julian felt a quiet sense of peace. His land, though battered, was still standing. And so was he.